Hi, it's Ken. Welcome to this week's live stream. It's the 27th of January, 2021, and our focus for this week is in which stage of consciousness am I? And there are a couple of things I want to cover before we dive in addition to saying hi to everyone who is on the line live. Angelica's checking in. Thanks so much for saying hi, Angelica. And to everyone else who's tuning in on YouTube and on the other platforms where the simulcast is going out, it's wonderful to be with you. I also want to welcome everyone who is watching the replay. It's an absolute honor to share some time with you to explore around what feels like an important spiritual topic to me, but just generally to sit in resonance, to go exploring spiritually speaking with you, and to see where the conversation unfolds is always an incredible honor. So welcome to everyone. And the only way I'll know or be able to interact with you, know that you're there, able to interact with you during the live stream is if you check in and say hi, as Angelica already has. Certainly you're under no pressure, but if you do, I promise I'll respond at some point. And if you have questions, I'm happy to respond to those. I also want to say for everyone who's watching the replay that I'd love to receive your comments, questions, reflections, and sharings and so on. And I'll be sure to comment on those through the comments section below the video. Okay, with that out of the way, there are a couple of really kind of important headline items that I'd like to cover before we dive into exploring our topic for today in today's video. And the first of these is that it's really important to sort of set the stage for our conversation. And I think the first thing I want to say is let's ask the question, in which stage of consciousness am I in this moment? Because it's really a moment to moment question. And if only it were even just moment to moment and topic to topic, but I think it's more interesting than that. And that's a good thing. And it also might be a little frustrating in terms of trying to categorize or delineate. Here's where I'm at. This is where I'm at in my life, and so on. So goes the spiritual journey, right? The other thing I want to say is that our exploration is in support of you discovering things about yourself for yourself. And in particular, I really want to invite you to open up to a deep appreciation for the journey that you've gone through and the role of the stages of consciousness in your journey. I want to stay away from trying to utilize the stages of consciousness as either a way of judging internally or externally, looking at someone else and saying, they're in that stage of consciousness. That's what's going on for them. And really instead turn inward and explore that question within each of us for ourselves. And I'll respond to the folks that are saying hi here in just a minute. The other thing I want to say about the stages of consciousness, and maybe there are two more things I want to say, but the first of those two things is that each stage is essential and critical, and each stage brings with it its own gifts. So it's not like we can say stage 2 is better than 1 because it's 1 more than 1, or 3 is better than 2. Although there might be preferences that we begin to recognize, I'm going to suggest probably those preferences are coming from a perspective of separation rather than wholeness. Because in wholeness, in our integrated experience of wholeness, are all the stages of consciousness, but they're integrated rather than unintegrated. And I'll explore more of what that means here in just a moment. The last thing I want to say is that one of the gifts that comes out of each developmental stage is in fact integration, right? And integration isn't something that's dependent on our ability to understand or to process something intellectually. Integration can happen on its own. And I wish I could think of a simple example of that. I'm sure something will come into my mind and I'll share it with you, or somebody will have a suggestion. But the point I want to make about this is that to sort of beware of the siren song of separation that is constantly lobbing that desire, that invitation, or an emphasis on the idea that you need to understand what's going on before you can move on in whatever part of your life, before you can be more successful, and so on. Okay, before we dive into our topic for today, I just want to take a moment and say hi. Sue is checking in. Wonderful to see you. Thanks for saying hi. And Julie, wonderful to be with you as well. And to everyone who's tuning in, it's wonderful to be with you. It is truly an honor to go exploring in this way. So, the first question, or the first way that I want to address this, is just to set the stage. What are the stages of consciousness? And then how do we go about discovering in which stage? And perhaps of equal importance is, what is the value of knowing which stage of consciousness we're in? So the thing I want to do is I actually want to focus on the stages of consciousness as a very, very simple concept, maybe differently in a different way than I've ever before explored with you. And let's think of stage one consciousness as matters that are outside, over which we have no influence. Now, there's a beware that goes with that, but I'm just going to say this again so you can sit with it for a moment. Stage one is dominated by an identification with the stuff that's going on out here, right? Not inside our mind per se, but out here, over which we have no influence. Now, there's an aspect of stage one that looks like we have influence, that plays a little game, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. The second stage of consciousness is where we are focused on both the outside and the inside, but now we have influence. But the influence, and this is key for stage two, the influence originates inside. In other words, it originates in the way that I'm thinking about or the way that I'm approaching something. The influence does not include trying to have influence over someone else. If we get into a dynamic where we're trying to influence someone else without focusing on the source of that influence being internally, now we've drifted back into stage one. And this is the beware. Beware of the drama triangle. And let's just remind ourselves, Karpman's drama triangle describes a dynamic of interacting, and I've defined it as sort of a late stage one dynamic. And there are three roles in the drama triangle. We can see these played out on television and movie screens all around the world. It's a common area of focus. It's a common drama. And there are three roles: the perpetrator, the rescuer, and the victim, right? So we've got somebody who's doing something, the recipient of the doing, and then someone else who's trying to rescue. And actually, it doesn't require three. It could be between two people, and you can even get into a drama triangle if you really focus on it internally with yourself, where you're playing each of those roles. Here's the fascinating thing about the drama triangle, at least fascinating to me. You can't just play one of those roles. You have to play all three. The minute you play one role, you are destined to play all three roles. So if you think, I'm going to rescue, eventually you'll be the perpetrator and you'll also be the victim. And if you think, I am the victim here, this is someone else is doing something, there's the perpetrator, and if only someone would come along and rescue me, it's inevitable you'll be playing all three roles. And to be clear, this game, this drama triangle dynamic, is playing out in the context of stage one. And again, the way I've defined stage one is stuff outside over which we have no influence, but with this caveat. We play a game where we appear to have influence. And I don't want to, offer a surprise preview of the result of that drama triangle, but I'm guessing everyone who's participating in the video here, everyone who's watching, already realizes this. You can't actually rescue someone else, and you can't actually affect someone else's life or have an impact on them outside of you. There are lots of things we can do that would appear to create that dynamic, but there's no way for that to actually take place. Whereas in stage 2, we realize, oh, I have an enormous amount of influence over what's going on. Maybe I have ultimate influence over what's going on in my life, but the source of that influence is inside of me. It may have something to do with the intentions that I hold and so on. But that's how I'm influencing. I'm not actually reaching outside of myself trying to affect somebody else's life by doing something. I'm doing the doing action in stage 2 is internal. And then stage 3, just to fill this out for simplicity's sake, is inside only. So there's only an interior dynamic in stage 3. Now, this might be a different way of thinking about it than the way that I've explored this in the past. Gene is checking in. Gene, it's wonderful to be with you. Thanks for saying hi. And again, I just want to welcome everyone who's tuning in. If you're just tuning into the live stream, the focus this week is answering the question, in which stage of consciousness am I in right now? Which stage of consciousness am I in right now? And I want to add the subtitle to this, in this moment. Now, let's talk about that for a minute. Why in this moment? The stages of consciousness, if we think about them, stage 1, stage 2, and then of course there's stage 3, interior only. Stage 4 would be a dynamic where there's no differentiation between the interior and the exterior. It's a fully integrated dynamic. If we want to use a different set of words to try to describe the stages of consciousness, we could think of stage 1, the exterior, over which I have no influence. You could think of it as disempowered and unintegrated. And 2, where there's an exterior and an interior focus over which I have influence, but the source of my influence is internal. It's in my mind. In that dynamic, you could think of it as empowered and unintegrated. And if we move to the 3rd stage of consciousness, where it's an interior only focus, you could think of this as an experience of wholeness, but it's still unintegrated. Okay. And then stage 4, we have an integrated experience. Stage 4, another way of thinking of this might be union consciousness. And in union consciousness, we have 1, disempowerment, but now it's integrated, and 2, empowerment, now it's integrated. And we also have 3, wholeness, now integrated. So we have a disempowered experience, an empowered experience, and an experience of wholeness, all of which are contained within the dynamic of stage 4. But let's just set aside 4 for a minute and focus on the 3. In which stage of consciousness am I in this moment? Why in this moment? Because we're moving between the stages of consciousness all the time. There might be an aspect of your life where you are in a more integrated dynamic. Let's say you're having an experience of stage 3. You realize this is an internal dynamic exclusively, and you're having a beautiful experience. That's your natural inclination around topic X. It's all interior. And there might be another aspect of your life where you're having a dynamic where it's all external. You feel like you have no influence whatsoever. Maybe there's a little bit of drama triangle showing up. And the frustration might be, my gosh, over here in this part of my life, I'm having an experience in stage 1. And then over here, I'm having an experience at stage 3. It's never this simple, by the way. It's never this cut and dry. It's much more subtle. I'm just trying to paint with a sort of a simple example. Okay, I'm just going to take a pause here because that's a lot of information in a short period of time. Energized by my enthusiasm for exploring this topic with you. I just want to excuse me, I just want to slow down a little bit and come to sort of deeper presence with this. Each stage of consciousness offers and contains within it a unique set of gifts. And although those gifts, we might even think of them as archetypal gifts, but my particular experience of that archetypal gift integrated might be very different than yours. It might be very unique. And the same is true for you. And if we think about these gifts, which are contained or expressed or delivered in each stage of consciousness, we can start to think of the stages of consciousness not as superior or inferior, but as essential in our developmental work as human beings, especially in consciousness. So, in other words, the gifts contained within an experience of disempowerment that's unintegrated are just as essential as the gifts that are contained with an experience of wholeness that's unintegrated. Even though, I mean, I'll just tell you, there have been times when I've had a strong preference. I'd much rather be focused on an experience of wholeness that's unintegrated than to go be present with those aspects of my life where I have had or am having an experience of being disempowered and unintegrated. But I really, really want to emphasize this. They're all valuable. All the stages are valuable. And in fact, in my newsletter today, and From My Heart, I made reference to this by talking about how we could think about each stage of consciousness as a different element of a dwelling, a roof, a wall, the plumbing, the electrical system, etc., the foundation. And in my commentary today, what I said was, well, what is it? What is stage one? What is stage two? Which part of the house is it? And my suggestion was, it doesn't matter. It's only together that these elements of the house have value in their totality, right? And if we said, well, the roof is the most important thing, the roof doesn't have meaning or value without the walls. Okay, so that having been the case, then inevitably we have to ask ourselves the question, well, then why does it matter what stage of consciousness we're in? And I guess at some level, that's a perfectly, well, it's not just a reasonable response, it seems spot on from my perspective. What is the point? And if we set aside the idea that we're getting into a place of judgment, I see your question, Sue, and I will answer it. It's a really important question. In fact, I'm going to put it up on the screen so I don't forget about it. What do you mean by integrated? Integrated into what? Well, let me just circle back to what I was saying here for just a moment. What was I saying? Give me just a moment. I'll get to it, I promise. What is the value of understanding the stage of consciousness? You could say, well, there's no value, and okay, fine. But I want to suggest there actually is a value, and it's not just a value held in separation. If we begin to recognize this dynamic or this part of my life is showing up in stage one, and this dynamic and this part of my life is showing up in stage two, or whatever it is, we begin to receive not only the roadmap for what is available to be done from a developmental perspective, but we can also then recognize if this isn't integrating, and back to Sue's question, what does that mean? We'll talk about that here in a second. But if that isn't integrating, there's a further level of exploration that's being invited. And one way that we can tell if something isn't integrated is if we keep revisiting the same theme over and over and over again. And and it could come from many different perspectives, but especially if we're revisiting a theme and we're thinking, when am I going to get the lesson here? Because I'm really tired of fill in the blank dynamic in my life. Something isn't integrating. Okay, so what does it mean to integrate? When I'm referring to integration, what I'm referring to is a process that results in the individual aspects of you, of me, of any of us that are in a state of alignment and resonance with the divine and themselves and one another. So if something is resonating in a state of alignment, what that would mean to me at least is that it is expressing as it truly is. And if we're thinking about this in terms of the human expression, we could say it's expressing as the undistorted um, extension of the divine. So the divine itself. So think of it as a light, if you want, that is expressing undistorted, unbroken, undiminished as it really is, and now as or through the expression of you. So just to take this a little bit further, one of the ways that people sometimes talk about integration is as it relates to the mind, the soul or the spirit, and the body. So oftentimes we can perceive these as distinct expressions, but once they're integrated, we have an experience of them as one whole. So integration isn't so much about into something, but integration between, or the integration of this cell with its divine expression on every level of its being. I'm just going to sit for a moment and see if anything else comes up around. So the point then, if we just put this in the context of the stages of consciousness, there is an opportunity to integrate those aspects that are disempowered, and another way of saying it is and separate, so that now there's an experience of disempowered, but not unintegrated or separate, but and whole. Another way of referring to the transition between unintegrated and integrated is that one is having an experience of wholeness of that aspect that is integrated. And I know I'm sounding circular, so let me just stop for a moment and try to use a simple example. So let's say someone makes a comment, and let's not make it a comment though. Let's say I'm going through life and I wake up some morning and a thought hits my mind, and I'm in a bad mood. I'm really upset, I'm cranky, and something is pushing my buttons and I don't even know what it is. So the way I interpret that is that there's some aspect of my unintegrated or my separate self that is showing up for attention. And the question becomes then, well, okay, Ken, how do you integrate that? And the process of integration, from my perspective, is facilitated most profoundly when we are fully present and allow ourselves to express completely whatever, or feel completely whatever is as yet unintegrated, while at the same time practicing or being supported or witnessed in a embodied dynamic where our souls are in an embodied dynamic. In other words, in a dynamic where we're feeling and experiencing viscerally, or in the other ways that we encounter and experience the divine within our being, at the same time that perhaps paradoxically, we're feeling and expressing the noise, the dissonance, the unintegrated stuff that's coming up. Okay. It's a lot of big concepts here. let's see if we can, well, I just want to pause for a moment and kind of take a breath before I see if there's anything else, or even just to offer a summary. These topics are among many things that are in my awareness all the time. And so for me, they're familiar. And sometimes I can move through them at a tempo that is difficult to follow conceptually. Although, as I said at the beginning, there's a risk to thinking that we need to understand something fully before we can actually engage with it. It's one of the reasons why I like to move into a guided meditation, into divine connecting breath, and into transmission before we wrap up our time together each week, because whatever we've been talking about or whatever I've been teaching or exploring with you, the idea of it might have some meaning, but the experience of the divine within and all that follows, at least from my perspective, is far more important than any concept that I could share with you. Okay. Clint is asking a question. Let me see if I can pop this up here. He says, would integrated stage 1 look like knowing what I can't or have no reason to control? I don't know that that is, I mean, that's an interesting question. Hmm. So would the integration of stage 1 look like knowing what I can't or have no reason to control? No, not for me, it wouldn't. For me, the integration of stage 1 includes the experiences of disempowerment that are an aspect of life without needing to cast them from the perspective of being separate. Let me see if I can say that a different way. And I want to be careful about using the term knowing. And I'm going to use an example of knowing. Well, let me first delineate what I mean by this. So there's a way of understanding something that I know intellectually. So let's say you learn intellectually or logically um, a math concept. Okay, 2 plus 2 equals 4. I know that intellectually. And that's really the extent at which that type of knowledge is available to be encountered or experienced. But there are other types of knowledge I want to suggest. There's a knowledge that includes an experiential component. For example, um, you might be teaching me that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And instead of just thinking about it, I might have, I don't know, objects of food or something, marshmallows. Here are 2 marshmallows, and here are 2 marshmallows. And now I'm having an experience of combining these marshmallows together and seeing and touching and feeling, experiencing that there are 4 marshmallows here. It's not a great example because the experience is fairly limited. But if we go into a science lab, we might study biology and understand it intellectually. And then we might go into a lab and have an experiential dynamic with what we're learning about. So, for example, if we're studying frog anatomy, we might look at pictures on a page and have intellectual exploration and acquire the knowledge, the intellectual knowledge. But then we might also have a lab where we're dissecting the frog. And so now we're having an experience of the frog's anatomy. And there's actually another level of knowledge I want to suggest, which is an embodied knowledge. So There's intellectual, there's experiential, and then there's embodied knowledge. And embodied knowledge is knowledge that is a function of what has integrated. Um, it's difficult to use an example other than spirituality for me, and that may be because embodied knowledge is limited to spirituality. I'm not sure that's true, though. For example, okay, so if I say to you, here's what an experience of holding a newborn child is like, right? And there's a description. You are holding a human being that has just been born, that is just taking its first breath, and here that experience has is an important experience, let's just say. And then there might be an experiential dynamic of that knowledge wherein I'm describing, here's what my experience, or we have a panel of people, here's my experience, here's our experience of holding newborns. Now, embodied knowledge comes when you hold a newborn, or let's say you hold your own newborn child. It's completely different. That's an example of embodied knowledge. Maybe, I mean, there's a spiritual component to that, and maybe that's the point. So how would we have embodied knowledge of what is integrated in stage one? It's very difficult to speak of. The words might be exactly the same. It may not be difficult to speak of, but it might be difficult to differentiate linguistically what is embodied knowledge and what is intellectual knowledge. And this is one of the things that's sort of interesting and challenging about the developmental journey in consciousness. I can have the right words, or I can say something a particular way that might appear to indicate that the knowledge is beyond an intellectual knowledge. Or it might even appear that the intellectual knowledge is the most important thing, that knowing about it is what really matters. And what I want to suggest is that the knowledge that comes from an embodied perspective is an indication that it is integrated, and that it's not that it's the most important thing, it's that that is what happens when it integrates. The other experiences that take place prior to integration are also very important. They just have a different perspective and a different gift. So if we come back to the gift of the disempowered dynamic, it would be, for me, from my perspective, the embodied knowledge of one aspect of the gift of stage one would be the experience, the embodied knowledge of disempowerment that is not separate. Yeah. Julie says, IOW surrender. I'm not sure what that means, Julie, but maybe it's just because I'm in the frame of thinking intuitively and I'm not seeing something obvious. Jean says, knowing you are female or male, isn't that an example of embodied knowledge? It could be. It's a great question, Jean. It could be, right? I mean, from my perspective, the embodied knowledge of being male or female would come not just from the genitals, right? Not just from the existence of genitals. And even that isn't, see, now we're getting into a very interesting area, because gender identity is, there's this whole sort of area of focus around gender identity as a fluid dynamic and so on. But let's just try to stick with the simple version of this, or at least what I perceive to be the simple version of this. I'm not trying to say it's complicated if we're exploring something beyond the binary here. I'm just trying to say, for the sake of a more simple exploration. From my perspective, the embodied knowledge around gender comes in part from, let's say, the genitals, but the embodied experience of the divine masculine and feminine, to my perspective, is available in its entirety, no matter what the gender identity is, nor of the physical genitals that may be present or not, right? And it's a much more sort of complete point of exploration. If you say, I know what it is to be the embodiment of the divine masculine, or I know what it is to be the embodiment of the divine feminine, to my perspective, that is a function of a much more extensive and advanced exploration and experience, and an enormous amount of integration and embodiment. So I appreciate the suggestion, Gene, but from my perspective, I'm not sure that that's a simple example of embodied knowledge. I mean, one simple example of embodied knowledge that is maybe a little bit easier to grasp is in the developmental progression between, let's say, sex education, sharing or learning from friends who have had sexual intercourse, and having sexual intercourse yourself, right? Once you've had sexual intercourse, there's an embodied knowledge that is associated with that experience that is likely very different than either the intellectual knowledge from sex ed or the experiential knowledge that comes from hearing about other people's experiences of sex versus the direct experience oneself. Maybe that's a little bit easier. Okay. And Julie says, would an example of integration be when we shift from judgment to observing and discernment? Not necessarily. To my perception, the movement from judgment to a place of observing and discernment is actually a disembodied perspective. So there's a disidentification that goes on. I am not, this is all in my language from my perspective here, Gene. So bear with me. I certainly appreciate this may not resonate with you or with others in the circle, but in the process of disidentification is a process of disintegration initially, right? If I'm identified with my emotions or with my thoughts and I disidentify with that, I am not that, I may reduce the, what's a good word here? The volatility associated with that identification, right? So that may result in a much calmer experience, a much more peaceful experience. But I wouldn't describe that perspective as integrated. The integrated perspective of that, from my perspective, is when someone goes through the work of transmuting the dissonance associated with the thoughts and the feelings, and can once again say, not only am I my thoughts and my feelings, I am. So the developmental journey there is, I am these things, I am not these things, integration or embodiment, transmutation, and then at some point I this is a disintegrated perspective from my perspective, and then there's an integration that goes on wherein the emotion or the thoughts are no longer separate but are one. I am. I don't know if I'm articulating this entirely clearly, but that's my perspective on that. Okay. We've done a lot of heavy lifting. uh, I had some exercises I wanted to invite you to think about. I think they've already been sort of showing up here, but I'll share them with you if you want to consider them right now. And maybe in retrospect, this might be a video worth watching again. And sort of as you understand the things that I'm trying to talk about or the perspective that I'm sharing, if you go back and listen again and experience again, you might see that there's a shift perceptually going on. Your perspective might change based on whatever awareness may come up for you. And by the way, this, I don't mean this to say that, everyone is going to land on this square or that this thought is an example of an integrated thought. I know that I'm saying that, but it's why I'm trying to offer the qualification. Clint asked, is this an example of integration from stage one? And my qualification was not for me. That would not be an example of integration for me. And then I tried to give an example of what would be an integrated experience for me. And that's where I got to the whole business about embodied knowledge. And then when we're talking about embodied knowledge and we're trying to talk about integration, mindfulness, which I think is what you're making reference to. I think Jean had the, Julie had it out. Julie had the question, and then I didn't even realize Jean had put a comment here, but Julie asked the question about effectively mindfulness, right? Is the observer an example of integration? And from my perspective, it's not an integrated perspective. It's an essential developmental step, though. Let's correlate it to the stages of consciousness for just a minute. I wonder if this would be interesting for you to consider. So in the disempowered dynamic, there's an there's a primary identification with the disempowered separate self, right? So what would be some examples of thoughts or feelings that somebody who is identified in stage one in the disempowered separate self might have? Well, they might be thinking, all this bad stuff is happening to me. Maybe they're thinking there's evil and there's good, and the evil's taking over the world, and I'm trying to figure out what's good. By the way, I'm not trying to say this in a dismissive way. I'm just trying to get into the feeling experience of stage one and give voice in a meaningful way. I am not mocking at all the experience. Let's remember, each stage of consciousness is unique, profound, and infinitely valuable. Okay. So I'm in this dynamic and I'm identified in these feelings. If you say to me, Ken, you're not your thoughts and your feelings, I would say to you, no, I am. What do you mean I'm not my thoughts and my feelings? And so the shift, let's say, into stage two consciousness might be a mindfulness practice that is actually a disintegration. That is to say, no, there's a silent observer, and the observer is over here, and there's that aspect of you that's having that as emotions. Now, if the observer is here and the person who's having the emotions is here, who is the observer? What is this, right? And then we go into this exploration. This might go on for decades, right? We might have this experience of, I'm over here, I start to get upset, I feel overwhelmed. Whoa. Hold on a second, Ken. Just take a step back and remember, you are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. But see, in the developmental journey, at some point, these things need to come back, right? I can't be walking around, and I want to suggest to you, in an integrated state, I can't be walking around in this disintegrated dynamic. Those two places are at tension. And ultimately, this is all one, right? So we disintegrate developmentally, the observer and discernment and so on, all of the mindfulness process, right? But then at some point, as we move into 3, there needs to be a reintegration. We have to no longer am I encountering the emotion or the thought as this thing out here. I come and have a more intimate experience of it. And as I have a more intimate experience with it, I begin to feel it. And I feel it not from the perspective of being disintegrated, of observing. I feel it from the perspective of this is me, and I am allowing myself to fully encounter and express it. And I do that from an embodied place. So I'm no longer identified with the emotion or the thought. In this case, let's just say it's disempowered emotion or thought, but it could be empowered emotion and thought too, right? Either way, I'm no longer disidentified with that, but nor am I identified with it. I'm allowing myself to feel it fully. And then as that transmutes, the unintegrated aspect reveals its gift, which is an aspect of the whole self, which now can integrate and become part of the whole expression of you or of me or of us. Okay. I might get carried away if I go in too deep here. Gene is saying, wow, great discussion, so deep and useful. I'm really glad to hear that. And I think what I want to do is I just want to make reference to these simple ideas or simple suggestions, simple explorations that you can engage with. If you come back to your life and you just think about your life and you wonder or focus in, maybe there's a hot topic. There's something that is pressing in your life right now. And if you have, and it's interesting that we're talking about the observer. I'm not asking you to observe per se from the observer perspective, but from a more intimate encounter. Just notice and allow the awareness to come in. Is this something that is outside of me entirely, over which I have no influence? Is this hot topic inside and outside, and I have influence? I can influence with my thoughts. Or is it, or other disciplines associated with personal mastery? Personal mastery isn't just about thinking, but it's certainly initiated or supported profoundly by thoughts and other sort of ancillary practices. Or is it entirely an interior, a question of exclusively the interior? That might be interesting for exploring in which stage of consciousness am I in this moment. And then the last thing I want to offer you before we make our transition into meditation and transmission is there's an embodiment aspect. And let's leave it very, very simple. I don't think this is probably new information unless this is your first video. And if this is your first video, hallelujah. Congratulations for staying with it. You came in and we went straight for some deep stuff right off the bat. Thanks for being here and thanks for joining this circle and for opening up to this exploration. The embodied perspective might be, is this dynamic dominated by thoughts? That'd be one. Is it dominated by thoughts and feelings? That'd be two. Or is it dominated by being? And here we're into the hips. We're in a being perspective. So is it a thinking and feeling, or is it a being? And sometimes the being experience can be dominated by feelings or even thoughts. So the question really is, what's the lead energy? Because certainly in being, there are feelings and thoughts. Just like in thinking, there are feelings and there's a being experience. But you'll notice that if the lead energy is being, one way to describe it is a very grounded, centered, calm being experience. It's slow, at least that's how I perceive it. It's much slower. If I were to make a noise or hum a note, it's a much lower frequency. And actually, when someone is in their being presence, their voice has a certain, sometimes a huskiness, a much lower resonance. Here's an interesting thing. If you're with somebody and you're having a really intimate experience, a romantic dynamic, think about the what happens with your voice. It's interesting. Just maybe notice with your beloved or with yourself. The tone of a voice can communicate where that presence is. Is it being or feeling? Thinking is for me, much quicker. That's how I perceive it, and a much higher frequency. It's fast. Zzz. Being very slow. It's like a gear. It might be moving so slow, it's imperceptible. It's so slow. But the gear up here in thinking, very fast. And in between in feeling, bigger gear, slower, and a lower frequency. Just a few things that I hope can be of service in your exploration of this answer, ultimately for your own benefit. All right, let's set aside language for at least a few minutes before we wrap up. And I just want to say, whatever I have to offer with words, it is in service. I mean for it to be in service to your own awareness, ultimately in service to your exploration, your deepening of your relationship with the divine. I offer my perspective, not because I think that it's a fixed perspective that I want you to share or that I think needs to be a dominant perspective. I offer it with words in service to your own exploration and intimacy with the divine. And so it has a limited value, right? It has to fall away at some point. The ideas even need to disappear because they get replaced by that direct encounter with divinity. And it's through your central nervous system, through your perceptual lens, in whatever way the divine communicates with you. And one of the ways that the divine communicates through me is in transmission, which we could say, I guess, in one way, is about the enlivenment of the divine in you, but it's not predicated on words. It's just a way of sinking in and resonating, having an experience of integrated wholeness without any blah, 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 without any description, without any process, without a mental process or an emotional process, just experience, just raw experience. So that's what we're going to do now. We'll do a little guided meditation to open up to that, to allow the mind to make that transition, and then we'll open into that space. We'll sit there together for a little while in silence, and then we'll close our time together for today. That's what we're going to do next. With your eyes closed, breathing in and out through the nostrils, palms to the sky if all of that is comfortable for you. Please don't operate a motor vehicle or heavy equipment of any sort during this or any time we're together. It's not safe to do so. You never know when you're going to drop out, when you're going to fall asleep. You'll hear my words 1 minute and the next you'll think, wait a second, was that 20 minutes or an hour between that word and that word? Really what's happening from my perspective in that dynamic is very, very deep work is going on. And your mind just couldn't stay consciously aware, and so you went to sleep. But if you were driving a vehicle or operating heavy equipment or trying to do something else, it could be very dangerous for you or for others. So please take this seriously. Just set it all aside. If you're at your computer, you might think, well, I'm not going to hurt anyone. No, maybe not. But why would you limit your own experience of the divine? Why would you step away from a direct mystical encounter? I think that's possible. And why not open up to it and give yourself the gift of your entire presence? And as we open to this experience, let's do a little bit of breathing. Deep breath in and hold. And as you begin releasing this breath now out to the count of 8, letting go of everything that has come before in this day, all the way out to the count of 8. And there's a tempo that I'm aware of that sort of expresses through my entire being. I can see it visually, I feel it. But you know what? That's just for me. And if that tempo resonates for you as well, that's great. But really, just let your breath go out to the count of 8 at whatever pace feels right to you. Just be fully with that experience. And if you think, well, wait, he's just doing what? You're talking about breathing and I can barely understand, or your voice is disappearing, but I really want to hold on and know what you're going to say next. The knowing doesn't matter. Just let go. Be with the divine. It's right within you already. Just be with that experience. Deep breath in. Hold. And as you begin releasing this breath now, letting go of everything that has come before since you were born, all the way out to the count of 8. Your thoughts, your feeling, your emotions, and the dominant way of being, just let all of them leave with the breath. Another deep breath in. Hold. And as you begin releasing this breath now, letting go of everything that has come before since the inception of your soul, all the way out to the count of 8. Head, heart, hips, mystery. Notice the cue of breath in front of your face, my eyes closed still, breathing in and out through the nostril, palms to the sky. When I say notice, just notice in your intuitive screen with your imagination and the interior sense of awareness that might be revealing itself. Notice that cue of breath, one unit, another, and another, and another. And you breathe one in, it comes into your body and through the nostrils, and it just comes in without any condition criteria. It doesn't ask questions. You don't have to jump through any hoops. Did you kick the dog today? Did you cut somebody off in traffic? Did you flip somebody off? Did you swear at them? Did you say something hateful? Did you have a blah, blah? None of it matters. The breath comes in, doesn't ask you, what's the color of your skin, or what are your political beliefs, or how do you feel about this social issue, or there's no religious or spiritual test. In fact, there's no question about sexual orientation or gender identity. In fact, none of the ways that we perceive or think we might be separate from other human beings, none of that is evaluated at all in the breath. The breath just comes in to serve you fully. And not only does that breath serve you fully, but the cue at the back of the cue, another unit of breath comes in. And you keep breathing and just keep advancing. More breath, more breath. No questions, no criteria, flat out serving you fully. And you might notice in the cue a color beginning to reveal itself, perhaps fixed or dynamic, changing. If you're assigning a color with your imagination, maybe pick something that's not normally present in the body except perhaps in the eyes. And just notice as that color begins infusing itself through the entirety of the cue, almost like food coloring, like it's dropped into a pitcher of water. It just spreads naturally until the entirety of the cue is infused with that breath. And then you breathe in and then a fresh breath, but then it's infused as well. And then be with the breath from the perspective of the color with your next breath. And it's in through the nostrils towards the crown and then down into the lungs. And we can begin even just moving time forward very gently and smoothly initially. You're sitting in the lungs in your perceptual view. Just notice that color, it illuminates the vector of the breath. The breath comes to the lining the lung, a line in that color, and then it migrates into the bloodstream of the body. And then if you move time forward enough, you'll see that color, experience, know, sense it, imagine it on not just in one or two cells here or there, but through each and every cell of the body. And there's a simple conclusion we can draw here, a statement we can make. And I just invite you to be with your body and your awareness on every level, not on the edge of your seat, more relaxed and just with it and allowing the resonance to express itself however it will. Maybe it won't at all. And that's okay. Whatever comes in is perfect. The breath is becoming you, and you are becoming the breath. You might feel physical resonance. Some people don't feel resonance physically. It's not a visceral thing. It's maybe a sense of knowing, but not really intellectual either. It's like a body knowledge that doesn't appear to originate at the level of the body. There are lots of different ways this resonance can express. You might hear it, you might see it visually. Sure, of course. Oh, yeah, there's that color throughout the entirety of the body. And then, this brilliant light, this color serving every cell. Beautiful. The breath is becoming you and you are becoming the breath. There may be an intellectual knowing. Sure, oxygen, lungs, bloodstream, cells. Yep, that's true. The breath is becoming you and you are becoming the breath. Shifting your perspective from inside the lungs gently, slowly, until you can perceive the entire planet on the screen, all in one view. There it is, the breath of the planet. You might even be able to perceive that, yep, there you are breathing, and then the breath of the planet comes into the cue. And notice that's true for everyone. I mean, your neighbors' neighbors, people in your community, and beyond. Everyone is drawing from the breath of the planet. And we could say with each breath, you are connected to all those people by your breath. Not just people in your region, people on your continent or your island or your hemisphere or the planet. With each breath, you are connected to all of them. And it's not just that the breath of the planet serves people, it serves everything, right? Animals, insects, rocks, dirt, trees, water, fish, everything. We could say with each breath, you are connected to everyone and everything above, upon, and within the planet. Indeed, you may even begin experiencing yourself as breathing by and for and of the planet itself. At some point, the breath of the planet becomes the breath of the cosmos. For at the very edge of our atmosphere, that breath touches space and in turn, eventually, every other part of space. And so we can say with each breath, you are connected to everyone and everything throughout all of creation, including that energy that underwrites everything else, a light, the divine, perhaps originating at a great distance on the other side of the cosmos, yet with each breath it draws closer and closer and closer until eventually it is close enough that you can perceive those twin frequencies intertwined, expressing itself as the divine light, the frequency of the divine itself, and the frequency of perfect health. Not just perfect health as we might understand it as human beings, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and other ways, but also in all sorts of ways that we can't begin to comprehend and understand. Yet, all of that contained as and expressing as the divine light, eventually connecting in at the nostrils and then instantaneously throughout every level of your being, known and unknown. The invitation extended from the light to each of the smallest aspects of you. Come, return to your natural state of resonance and alignment. The divine is becoming you, and you are becoming the divine. For whatever remains in separation, I invite you to remove the universal plug. I'll do the same. Let's begin. Perhaps it's an emptiness, perhaps there are thoughts. If there are thoughts, you can let them run. Or if you'd like, you can remind yourself with each breath, you are connected to everyone, everything, the light, the twin frequencies connecting into each of the smallest aspects of you. The breath is becoming you, and you are becoming the breath. The divine is becoming you, and you are becoming the divine, and the river is flowing. You can begin feeling, perhaps even in the body, at whatever level the perceptual awareness is revealing itself. And perhaps there is no awareness, no sensation right now. It's perfect, whatever it is. Those artifacts of dissonance appearing to fall away and gather at that universal drain, the resonance spreading through your body, your mind. The divine is becoming you, and you are becoming the divine. And the river is flowing. Some discomfort comes up emotionally. Feel it, express it. Physically, feel it. Often the instinct is to minimize, to diminish, to walk away from, to dissolve, but instead walk towards, amplify. Allow yourself, if you're ready, to be consumed by whatever is coming up. It's only when you allow yourself to feel fully whatever it is that it can be transmuted. And sometimes there's a thought, oh, I'll just throw everything in here. Let's cook it all up now. Really, it's the stuff that's ready, that's in the queue. There's no way to artificially accelerate it, though, and also no real way, as I'm sure you've discovered already, to put it off truly. You can pretend, you can suppress, but it bubbles along and pokes its head up again with greater and greater demands for attention, greater intensity, until you finally focus and allow yourself to feel. It could be a profound sense of loss from the hundreds of thousands of people who have lost their lives in the last year around the world. Perhaps one or more of those people whose lives have been lost were people you knew and loved and cared about deeply. And there's been a numbness there, or a fear of allowing yourself to uncork and feel. And if those things are coming up right now, by all means, uncork and feel them fully. Sometimes it's just a great emptiness, like a vacuum, a void. Be with whatever is coming up fully, even if it's nothing. If your mind likes a job, give it this one. Remind it with each breath, you are connected to everyone and everything throughout the cosmos, including the energy that underwrites everything else, the divine, a light originating far, far away initially, drawing closer with each breath, the twin frequencies eventually connecting into each and every aspect, known and unknown, the invitation extended. Come return to your natural state of resonance and alignment, the artifacts of dissonance appearing to fall away. The divine is becoming you, and you are becoming the divine, and the river is flowing. Beautiful. I don't know what's unfolding for you in particular. I have only an experience of the aggregate of everyone who will ever watch or experience this video. For me, all are here now. And the aggregate experience I have is limited to the ways that the divine expresses that or illustrates that for me, which includes some buzzing hands and feet and other things. I'm having an experience of some discomfort in the head, which is always a really powerful sign of the integration that's unfolding. And the key, of course, is to be present with whatever your experience is. And if you're ready, to feel fully whatever is coming up. And when you're ready, hold nothing back. Be fully with the experience, emotionally, physically, and otherwise. The river is flowing. Whatever's coming up is perfect. It's just like the stages of consciousness. Whatever our experience is, whatever your experience is perfect. Whatever comes up in session, in transmission, is perfect. And if you'd like some work to do, you can just feel what's coming up fully. And if there's nothing there, be with that fully. In your mind, in your heart, in your hips, in the entirety of your being. Hmm. So beautiful. I just invite you to stay fully present with your own experience as it unfolds. I'm going to begin wrapping up our time together for today. Just stay with whatever's unfolding for you. If you feel drawn to share or reflect on it at all, you're certainly welcome to submit through the comments, either in the live chat on the live stream or in the comments below the video on replay. I'll do my best to interact, respond, acknowledge. Most importantly, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to sit and to resonate, to explore with you. And so I invite you to begin returning the universal plug. I'll do the same as I begin bringing this transmission to a close. Plug all the way in. Transmission to a close now. I'm just going to take a moment to acknowledge those who have checked in since I last looked at the comments, while thanking you and everyone here for gathering today for our exploration on In which stage of consciousness am I in this moment? Let me see. Santosh on Twitter. I often feel to know if all of this are true. Thank you for sharing, Santosh. Joanne, thank you, Ken. Thank you, Joanne. Santosh is asking if I drink Kangen water. I don't know what Kangen is, but I do drink water, and I can see this chat. Thank you for your comments over on Twitter, Santosh. If I'm saying your name correctly, I hope I am. Thank you for checking in. I drink lots of water, actually, and I encourage you to stay well hydrated anytime we gather. All the time, of course, but with special focus on that when we gather. Let's see if there are any other comments or reflections coming in. I don't see anything right now. And so I think I'll wrap up here with these reminders. The stages of consciousness are a wonderful reference point for appreciating and receiving and understanding to the degree we need to, and it's helpful. Each developmental stage of consciousness, with the recognition that each stage offers profound and unique gifts, and each has extraordinary value, which really is only available to us when we come to embodied knowledge, the direct experience of it, which probably we have a sense of for ourselves. But even when we do for ourselves, it's very difficult to have a sense of it for others. And so I invite the exploration of consciousness as an internal one rather than an external one. Oh, Santosh is saying, I want to ask one question. Go ahead, Santosh. I'll try to stay on the line and answer your question. There's a little bit of a delay on the feedback here on the live stream, but I'll stay patient. I often write time, place, and location. It helps to connect with present, but mental chattering is, and then there must be more coming in. Let me see if there's anything else to reflect on, Santosh, and everyone else in this circle while we're waiting for Santosh's question. Just honor what's showing up for you. Honor your experience, your developmental journey. It's not about a comparative process. But mental chattering, I feel regretful and cannot come out of shame. I'm just waiting for the question here. For anyone else on the YouTube channel, on Facebook simulcast, or on Twitter, if you have anything coming up that you'd like to reflect on or ask about or give voice to, you can jump in as well. So Santosh, I'm seeing you say, I often write time, place, and location. It helps to connect with present, but mental chattering is, and then I feel regretful and cannot come out of shame. So maybe the question, I just want to honor the conclusion for our live stream and invite you back for next week's live stream as well. In the description, there's a link to subscribe to YouTube, or you can visit me on my YouTube channel, which I think is at youtube.com. Let me see if I can think of the URL /Ken Stone. The Soul Archaeologist, maybe? I don't even know the name of my channel. Isn't that funny? So, Santosh, maybe you're asking, how do I address those feelings of regret or shame? And the answer to that question actually is held in each stage of consciousness. Each stage of consciousness has a different answer. So, in stage one, the answer tends to be painted in the polarity or in the interpretive perspective of spiritual or religious texts and experts who are focused on the polarity of good and evil or other expressions of the same. And so from a disempowered dynamic, that tends to be a place where we find answers to this question about regret and shame. Santosh is confirming, yes, this is the question. Thank you. In stage two, the answers come from experts and texts and so on that are focused around personal mastery. And the question then becomes how to control or manifest or resolve these feelings of regret and shame. Generally, in stage two, it's referred to as a process of clearing. So there can be, and this can come from many, many different perspectives, right? Traditions and so on. But generally, it's coming from a place of personal mastery or of mind mastery. So shame gets replaced, for example, with an affirmation or a mantra, for example. Santosh says, I'm in stage two. Okay, great. So the answers come in that context. Now, I want to offer the answer in three as well. The answer in three is that the shame and the regret are an experience of dissonance. That is to say, of the unintegrated self. And the answer in three is to feel them fully while sustaining soul embodiment. And when you do that, the gift that is wrapped up in separation of called shame and regret melts away. And in its place, an experience of love, profound connection, and peace flood in. But there's no reason or process to cause that to happen. It's simply the experience of feeling while remaining embodied. There's a big question, which I'm going to hold for next time, Gene. We'll leave this in the queue for next time, as I'd like to wrap up here. Thanks, Ken. How do the four stages relate to David Hawkins' map of consciousness? Calibrated scale, 0 to 1,000. That's a great question. I'm looking forward to exploring that and much more with you and everyone else in the circle. For now, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm grateful for this opportunity to sit, to resonate, to explore with you. Until we're together again very soon. Peace. Bye for now. Santosh says thanks again. Thank you, Santosh. Peace. Bye for